What is unfolding between Washington and Ottawa right now doesn't resemble routine bargaining. It doesn't even resemble the familiar friction of allied disagreements. It resembles separation papers being drafted in real time. For generations, the bond between the United States and Canada functioned as the model partnership, geographically seamless, economically intertwined, strategically aligned. It was steady, predictable, almost immune to drama. As of this afternoon, that era appears to be over. President Donald Trump assumed he was operating from a position of inherited leverage. The expectation in Washington was simple. Apply pressure, signal consequences, and Ottawa would recalibrate. That formula had worked before. But this time, the response was different. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not dispatch quiet envoys or soften the language. He delivered a public refusal. Not a delay, not a counterproposal, a refusal. And that single decision is already echoing through equity markets, currency desks, and long-term investment forecasts. The White House is scrambling to control the narrative. Cable news is fixated on the spectacle. But the real story is structural. Something fundamental shifted in the past 72 hours, and it may permanently alter the continental balance of power. Here's how it began. At dawn, the president posted a direct ultimatum. Canada must open its telecommunications infrastructure to full American ownership and place critical mineral exports under a joint U.S. supervised framework. The timeline, 48 hours. The consequence, 30% tariffs on Canadian lumber, aluminum, and steel entering the United States. Historically, that would have triggered a quiet diplomatic sprint. Ottawa would issue carefully phrased statements about partnership and shared interests. Back-channel discussions would attempt to cool tensions. This time, none of that occurred. Instead, Carney stepped to a podium in Ottawa and addressed the country and Washington without visible hesitation. He stated plainly that Canada would not comply. No transitional language, no soft landing. Then he raised the stakes. If tariffs materialize, Canada will restrict rare earth mineral shipments to U.S. defense contractors and suspend joint Arctic resource development agreements. Within minutes, markets began reacting. The Canadian dollar held steady. American construction and defense stocks slid sharply. For perhaps the first time in modern memory, an economic threat from Washington was met not with capitulation, but counter-leverage. This is not a symbolic dispute. It is a confrontation over supply chain architecture. The American housing sector depends heavily on Canadian lumber processed through integrated cross-border networks. Impose sweeping tariffs, and the cost doesn't stay in Ottawa. It travels directly into housing starts in Texas, Georgia, and Arizona. Defense production tells a similar story. Advanced military systems require nickel, cobalt, and specialized minerals sourced from Canadian reserves. Interrupt that pipeline, and procurement timelines begin to wobble. Reports from major contractors indicate internal contingency planning began almost immediately. Logistics teams examined alternate sourcing options, an acknowledgement that this is not a bluffing contest, but a material vulnerability. Now consider the mineral dimension more closely. Canada possesses some of the world's most significant reserves of cobalt, lithium, nickel, and rare earth elements, materials indispensable for semiconductors, missile guidance systems, battery production, and next-generation aircraft. When Carney referenced export restrictions, he was signaling potential constraints on inputs central to U.S. defense modernization. Even the suggestion was enough to rattle sector futures. Markets respond to risk exposure, and exposure is precisely what this episode revealed. Meanwhile, while Washington focused on confrontation, Ottawa focused on coalition building. Carney's background, former central banker, former head of the Bank of England, has embedded him deeply within global financial networks. As tensions escalated, conversations reportedly extended to European and Indo-Pacific partners about alternative mineral security arrangements. Early drafts of cooperative frameworks between Canada, the European Union, and Australia are already circulating among policy circles. This marks a strategic divergence. Washington applied unilateral pressure. Ottawa responded with multilateral architecture. The contrast is stark. The U.S. strategy relies on rapid escalation followed by swift compliance. But that model depends on the assumption that the targeted country fears immediate loss more than it values long-term autonomy. Carney has inverted that calculation. By signaling willingness to endure short-term strain, he reframed the confrontation as a test of sustainability. If tariffs proceed, domestic consequences in the United States would be immediate. Construction costs rise. Defense timelines slip. Manufacturers confront bottlenecks. Economic advisors reportedly warned of recessionary pressure if supply chains seize. Yet politically, retreat carries its own risks for the administration. Public ultimatums are difficult to unwind without appearing weakened. So the escalation cycle feeds itself. Threats expand. Discussion of NORAD cooperation, visa policies, secondary sanctions. Each new lever increases volatility. But geography does not move. The border remains. Interdependence remains. You cannot simply relocate the largest bilateral trade relationship on the planet. Industry groups have begun voicing concern. Manufacturers warn of supply chain shock. Lawmakers in border states face pressure from constituents whose livelihoods are tightly bound to Canadian inputs. Silence from some quarters may reflect strategic caution rather than agreement. Amid this turbulence, Carney's demeanor is instructive. He projects composure, structured language, measured tone, detailed economic references. In periods of instability, markets gravitate toward predictability. By presenting Canada as steady and rules-based, he transforms confrontation into reputational capital. This is asymmetry in action. Canada cannot overpower the United States in a conventional contest, but it does not need to. It needs only to impose costs selectively, targeting sectors and regions politically sensitive within the U.S. system. Precision, rather than spectacle. Time horizon also matters. American politics runs on election cycles and quarterly earnings. Canada's leadership appears prepared for a longer game. Endurance can become leverage when the opposing side requires immediate wins. Why should this concern you? Because the North American economy functions less like two separate engines and more like a single integrated machine. Components cross the border multiple times before becoming finished products, disrupt the machine, and friction spreads quickly into housing prices, grocery bills, energy costs, and retirement portfolios. If tariff walls rise and mineral flows constrict, you will feel it in the cost of construction materials, in consumer goods influenced by transportation energy, and in industrial investment decisions. This is not abstract geopolitics. It is embedded in daily commerce. Beyond economics lies a deeper implication. The assumption of automatic American compliance is eroding. For decades, when Washington applied pressure within the Western alliance, alignment followed. Canada's refusal challenges that presumption. If one of America's closest allies publicly resists, others may reassess their own calculations. This is not a narrative driven by Beijing or Moscow. It is an internal recalibration among partners who are reconsidering dependency versus sovereignty. Carney's argument is straightforward. Alliances must operate between equals. Sovereignty is not negotiable collateral. By drawing that boundary, he reframes the debate from trade to principle. So where does this lead? First possibility, a prolonged standoff. Tariffs are enacted. Canada responds with targeted restrictions. Markets absorb the shock. Business leaders and legislators eventually broker a compromise after measurable economic pain. Second possibility, escalation beyond economics. Emergency authorities invoked. Border slowdowns intensify. Secondary sanctions appear. This path would accelerate recessionary dynamics across industrial regions on both sides of the border. Third possibility, strategic diversification. Canada accelerates partnerships with Europe and Indo-Pacific economies, reducing reliance on U.S. markets over time. Short-term disruption gives way to structural realignment. At present, the trajectory appears closest to a grinding confrontation with escalating rhetoric. Statesmanship could still intervene, but it requires willingness to de-escalate without humiliation. We are in unfamiliar territory. The assumption that the U.S.-Canada relationship is unshakable has been tested in a way few predicted. Carney demonstrated that leverage can offset scale, at least temporarily. But leverage carries consequences. The real question is endurance. Who absorbs more pressure? Who recalibrates first? Is this the rupture of a continental partnership or the shock that forces a renegotiation on equal footing. Markets will offer their verdict when trading floors open again, and the world will be watching closely.